There are stories of love that shine brightly under the world's gaze, catching attention with every smile, every glance, and every shared moment. Then there are love stories that burn quietly, hidden from the eyes of the world, leaving traces of pain, longing, and silent tears. Pattie Boyd's life is one of the latter. She was not only a stunning model who became one of the icons of 1960s London, but also the woman who inspired some of rock music's most famous love songs, including George Harrison's Something and Eric Clapton's Layla. Yet, beneath the glamour, the fame, and the admiration of millions, Pattie endured betrayal, heartbreak, and years of emotional struggle that were invisible to the public. Born in 1944, Pattie spent her early years moving between England and Kenya, experiencing long separations from her parents and time in boarding schools. This early exposure to loneliness shaped her resilience and her ability to endure pain silently. By the time she was 18, the fashion world had already begun to notice her. Her luminous skin, almond-shaped eyes, and effortless charm made her a favorite for photographers such as David Bailey and Terence Donovan, and she quickly became one of the defining faces of London's swinging 60s fashion scene. She modeled for magazines like Vogue and Elle, but little did anyone know that her life was about to intersect with one of the most famous rock bands in history. In 1964, she was cast in a small role in the Beatles' first film, A Hard Day's Night, and it was here, amid the whirlwind of Beatlemania, that she met George Harrison, the quiet, introspective guitarist. George, who was then only 20, asked Pattie to marry him on the spot. She laughed, refused politely, explaining that she already had a boyfriend, but destiny had other plans. Just months later, their paths crossed again during a photo shoot, and this time, she agreed to dinner. From there, their love moved quickly, leading to a private wedding on January 21st, 1966, the same day the Beatles released Yellow Submarine. Pattie was 21, George 22, and both were thrust into a life of immense fame, excitement, and pressure, all while trying to navigate their personal relationship. For a time, it seemed like a dream. George wrote love letters to her while on tour, and Pattie waited for him between modeling assignments, appearing to the world as the perfect muse, the perfect wife, the perfect couple. But the pressures of fame, the constant attention, and George's growing fascination with spirituality would slowly pull them apart, leaving cracks in what had once appeared unbreakable. In the early years of their marriage, Pattie believed she had found her soulmate. George Harrison was thoughtful, gentle, and deeply romantic. He seemed different from anyone she had ever met. However, as the Beatles rose to unprecedented global fame, the pressures of constant touring, media attention, and personal challenges began to weigh heavily on their relationship. By 1967, the Beatles were no longer the playful, cheeky group from Liverpool. They were international icons, consumed by drugs, pressure, and the search for deeper meaning in life. George, in particular, felt a spiritual calling that took him far from the comforts and realities of domestic life. He immersed himself in meditation and the teachings of Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, seeking peace and enlightenment. Pattie followed him, hoping that spiritual exploration might bring them closer together, but instead, it often pushed them further apart. She later reflected that George became so absorbed in spirituality that he seemed to escape the real world entirely. Hours of chanting, meditation, and reading sacred texts became a routine, and any attempt by Pattie to connect with him emotionally was met with gentle dismissal or requests not to disturb him. Their once lively and music-filled home became quiet, distant, and emotionally cold. Pattie began to feel invisible, a shadow in her own life. Meanwhile, George started spending long nights at the Apple offices, often surrounded by admirers and those who flattered his ego. Rumors of infidelity swirled, and eventually, one confirmed betrayal struck Pattie deeply. George was involved with Maureen, the wife of a close friend. She walked into her home to find the two together, a moment that filled her with humiliation, despair, and heartbreak. In response, she performed a small act of defiance, lowering the spiritual flag George had raised in their home and replacing it with a pirate's skull and crossbones, a fleeting moment of empowerment amidst deep pain. While George retreated into silence and spiritual obsession, another figure quietly fell under the spell of Pattie Boyd, Eric Clapton. Eric, already one of the most admired guitarists of the world, was captivated by Pattie's beauty, charm, and the sadness that lingered behind her luminous eyes. His admiration soon turned into obsession. He sent her secret love letters, one of which Pattie initially mistook for a fan note. When he eventually revealed himself, she realized the depth of his passion. Unable to contain his feelings, Clapton channeled his heartbreak into one of rock music's most enduring love songs, Layla. His love for her, intense and unyielding, ultimately drove him toward heroin addiction, as he could not bear the idea of her belonging to anyone else. The early 1970s brought Pattie to a crossroad of heartbreak and new hope. By this time, her marriage with George had deteriorated beyond repair. His infidelity, distance, and spiritual obsession had created a chasm that could not be bridged. At the same time, Eric Clapton's love for her persisted, growing both more intense and more complicated as he battled his own demons. Eric's addiction and emotional instability mirrored George's earlier detachment, yet Pattie found herself drawn to the passion and intensity of Clapton's devotion. By 1974, after years of hesitation and emotional uncertainty, she left George and entered a life with Eric. At first, their relationship seemed like a fresh start, filled with music, affection, and new experiences. Pattie traveled with Eric on tour, stood by his side as he played songs inspired by her, and for the first time in years, felt part of someone else's world. Yet, the reality behind the scenes was often starkly different. The touring lifestyle, late nights, and heavy drinking created a cycle of distance and emotional struggle, echoing patterns from her previous marriage. Despite the music, the fame, and the attention from the world, Pattie struggled to find the stability and love she had longed for. She endured failed attempts at starting a family through IVF treatments, suffering deeply as her desire to become a mother went unfulfilled. Meanwhile, Eric's personal struggles, including continued substance abuse and infidelity, kept the relationship fraught with tension. One of the greatest emotional blows came when Eric fell in love with another woman, an Italian actress named Lori Delanto, and fathered a child with her. For Pattie, this was devastating, a painful echo of George's betrayals years before. Over time, the emotional strain, humiliation, and repeated heartbreak led her to a clear realization. The life she thought she deserved, full of love, respect, and companionship, was slipping through her fingers. In 1989, after years of enduring emotional abuse, addiction, and loss, Pattie finally filed for divorce from Eric Clapton. This decision marked a turning point. Unlike previous moments of heartbreak, she approached this separation with clarity and strength. She no longer sought validation from a partner or identity through being someone's muse. Instead, she began the long process of healing and reclaiming her life and the decades that followed. Pattie Boyd rebuilt her life with patience, reflection, and creativity. No longer a model, no longer defined by the men who had loved and hurt her, she focused on herself. Photography became her sanctuary, a way to capture the world through her own lens rather than being captured by it. Through her work, she earned respect as an artist in her own right, showing that she was more than a muse or a famous wife. Even as she processed past pain, Pattie maintained connections with both George Harrison and Eric Clapton. She spoke fondly of George in his later years, remembering him as kind and gentle despite the failings of their marriage. Eric, too, remained in her life from a distance, and she often worried for him during moments of personal tragedy, such as the death of his young son Connor. In 2007, she published her memoir, Wonderful Tonight, revealing to the world a story far more complex than anyone had imagined. Readers discovered not only tales of love and heartbreak, but also the resilience of a woman who refused to lose herself, despite betrayal, addiction, and fame's cruelty. Through it all, she reflected on her mistakes, learned forgiveness, and embraced her own identity. Her words carried a quiet wisdom. I don't regret loving them, but I wish I had loved myself sooner. By the time she reached 80 in 2025, Pattie Boyd had found peace, continuing to travel, exhibit her photography, and speak about resilience, creativity, and forgiveness. Her life, intertwined with some of rock's greatest icons, reads like a love song with too many verses, some beautiful, some heartbreaking. But through it all, she discovered her own rhythm and her own strength. Before the fame, the heartbreak, and the rock and roll drama, Pattie Boyd was simply a young girl with dreams. Born Patricia and Boyd in 1944, she spent her childhood moving between England and Kenya, experiencing the unique challenges of a transient upbringing. Her parents' separation meant long stretches of time away from family, often in boarding schools, where she learned early how to cope with loneliness. This sense of independence and self-reliance shaped her personality, teaching her to endure emotional distance and to hide pain behind a poised exterior. By her teenage years, Pattie had developed a natural elegance and beauty that caught the attention of photographers and designers alike. London in the early 1960s was a city alive with music, art, fashion, and rebellion. The city was bursting with energy, and young people like Pattie were drawn to its vibrancy. The fashion world quickly recognized her luminous skin, almond-shaped eyes, and a kind of effortless charm that seemed timeless. She became a favorite for magazines like Vogue and Elle, as well as for celebrated photographers such as David Bailey and Terence Donovan. By 18, Pattie was already walking the runways of London, appearing in photo shoots that captured the spirit of the era. But it was not just a fashion that defined her life. She was entering a world on the edge of historic cultural change. London in the 1960s was more than a city. It was a stage for transformation. Music, art, and social revolution collided, giving birth to the swinging 60s, a period marked by creative energy, youthful optimism, and bold experimentation. It was in this environment that Pattie would first meet George Harrison, setting the stage for a love story that would capture the imagination of millions. Her early life, marked by both privilege and separation, had prepared her for pressures and excitement to come, yet nothing could prepare her for the intensity of being thrust into the center of Beatlemania. The whirlwind of fame, love, and public scrutiny was about to change everything she thought she knew about life and herself. Pattie's story reminds us that behind the glamour of fame, there are real people with real emotions, shaped by the experiences of their childhood, their family, and the world they grow up in. It was this combination of beauty, resilience, and quiet intelligence that drew both George Harrison and later Eric Clapton into her orbit. It was these qualities that would sustain her through years of love, betrayal, and eventual self-discovery in 1964. Pattie Boyd's life took a sudden and dramatic turn when she was cast in A Hard Day's Night, the Beatles' first feature film. On set, she met George Harrison, the youngest and quietest member of the band. George was not immediately the flamboyant superstar the world would later know. He was shy, introspective, and quietly intense. Their first meeting was charged with a kind of instant, unspoken connection, the kind that feels fated. George reportedly asked Pattie to marry him on the spot, an impulsive and romantic gesture that she politely refused, explaining she already had a boyfriend. But fate had other plans. Months later, during a chance encounter at a photo shoot, George invited her dinner, and she accepted. From that moment, their love grew quickly, set against the backdrop of a world that was already fascinated with the Beatles. They married on January 21st, 1966, in a small, private ceremony in Surrey. At 21, Pattie was now part of a life that millions around the world were obsessed with. George, just 22, had already achieved global fame, yet the pressures of being a Beatle were only beginning to mount. At first, their marriage seemed ideal. George wrote her letters while touring, professing his love and devotion. Pattie balanced her modeling career with life as a Beatles wife, often appearing as the embodiment of the era's beauty, elegance, and grace. But the bright exterior hid a growing emotional distance. As George became more involved in spiritual pursuits, particularly his interest in Indian philosophy and meditation, he began to withdraw emotionally from Pattie. She followed him to India in hopes that spiritual exploration might bring them closer, but instead, it often drove a wedge between them. Hours of chanting, meditation, and studying sacred texts left little room for emotional connection or domestic intimacy. Pattie described feeling invisible in her own home, a silent observer to a man increasingly lost in his own inner world. George's increasing detachment coincided with the temptations of fame. Long nights at the Apple offices, surrounded by admirers and enablers, pulled him further away. Rumors of affairs began to circulate, and the first confirmed betrayal arrived when Pattie discovered his involvement with Maureen, the wife of a friend. The humiliation and heartbreak she experienced were profound. In a symbolic gesture, she replaced George's spiritual flag in their home with a pirate's skull and crossbones, a brief assertion of control in a life that seemed increasingly out of her hands. These years of marriage, while filled with moments of beauty and shared passion for music, were ultimately defined by growing emotional distance and the painful realization that love alone could not overcome George's obsessions and infidelity. While George Harrison withdrew into spirituality and emotional distance, another man quietly fell under Pattie Boyd's spell. Eric Clapton, already recognized as one of the greatest guitarists in the world, Clapton was captivated by Pattie's beauty, charm, and a sadness that lingered beneath her poised exterior. What began as admiration quickly turned into obsession. Clapton sent secret love letters, one of which Pattie initially mistook for a fan note, only to discover later that it came from him. Unable to contain his emotions, Clapton poured his love, longing, and anguish into music, creating the song Layla, a masterpiece born from unrequited desire. His obsession was so intense that it drove him toward heroin addiction, a desperate attempt to cope with the pain of loving someone already married. Pattie, though flattered, also felt fear. The intensity of Clapton's feelings, combined with his struggles with addiction, created an atmosphere of tension and unpredictability. Yet, despite the turmoil, Pattie found herself drawn to Clapton's passion, a stark contrast to George's distant love. By the mid-1970s, after enduring years of emotional struggle and betrayal, Pattie left George and began a life with Eric. Initially, it seemed like a new beginning, filled with music, affection, and shared adventures. She traveled with him on tour, witnessing the creation of songs inspired by her presence, and for the first time in years, felt deeply loved and desired. By the mid-1970s, Pattie Boyd's life had entered a new chapter with Eric Clapton. At first glance, their relationship seemed like a fresh start after years of heartbreak and betrayal. Eric's love for her was intense, visible in the way he wrote songs inspired by her, most notably Layla and later Wonderful Tonight. These songs immortalize her as a muse in rock history, a woman whose beauty and spirit inspired some of the world's most famous melodies. For Pattie, being with Eric offered moments of joy and tenderness that she had not experienced for years. She traveled with him on tour, watching from the sidelines as he played riffs and melodies that told stories of longing, heartbreak, and devotion. The connection felt raw, real, and immediate, a sharp contrast to the quiet, distant love she had shared with George Harrison. Yet, as with her first marriage, the romance was not immune to the pressures of fame and the challenges of human imperfection. Touring life was relentless. Sleepless nights, constant travel, and the ever-present limelight took a toll. Eric, though deeply in love, struggled with his own demons. He had previously battled heroin addiction, and while that chapter of his life had ended, he now leaned heavily on alcohol to cope with the pressures of stardom and the emotional intensity of his relationships. Pattie, often quietly supportive, sometimes joined him in drinking, unknowingly repeating cycles of dependency and emotional strain she had witnessed before. These years were a paradox of beauty and pain. On one hand, they experienced love that was passionate, creative, and vibrant. On the other, they were trapped in cycles of neglect, emotional distance, and conflict. Pattie yearned for stability, a home, and a family, but Eric's unpredictable lifestyle made these desires difficult to realize. While the public saw rock royalty, glamorous parties, and celebrated romance, behind closed doors, Pattie endured loneliness, heartbreak, and profound sense of emotional invisibility. The world may have thought of her as the woman behind Clapton's greatest love songs, but in truth, her life was marked by repeated patterns of devotion, betrayal, and struggle, echoing the pain of her first marriage. As their life together progressed, Pattie faced one of the most personal and heartbreaking challenges of her life: infertility. Despite numerous attempts at conception through IVF and other treatments, she was unable to have children. Each failed attempt brought deep disappointment and sorrow, intensifying the emotional strain in her marriage. She watched as others around her started families, while she faced the stark reality that the life she had envisioned, a home filled with love, children, and stability, might never come to fruition. Meanwhile, Eric's attention was often elsewhere, consumed by his music, fame, and social life. The gap between their desires and realities widened. Then came another devastating blow. Eric fell in love with another woman, an Italian actress named Lori Del Santo, during his Milan tour. The betrayal felt like history repeating itself. He would later father a child with her, a public and permanent reminder of the love and family Pattie had longed for but could not achieve. Throughout this period, Pattie exhibited remarkable patience, endurance, and emotional resilience. Despite humiliation, heartbreak, and repeated disappointments, she stayed in the relationship longer than many would have, driven by a complex combination of love, hope, and a desire to find stability in a life that had never been stable. Yet, by the late 1980s, the emotional cost became too high. Eric's temper, infidelity, and reliance on alcohol, combined with years of personal sacrifice and heartbreak, led Pattie to a painful but necessary decision. In 1989, after years of endurance and emotional turmoil, she filed for divorce. This act was not just a separation from Eric. It was a reclamation of herself, her dignity, and her life. Unlike previous endings, she did not cry or linger in regret. She had already mourned the losses of love, trust, and personal dreams, and this final step marked the beginning of a new chapter, one that belonged entirely to her. The 1990s marked a profound turning point in Pattie Boyd's life. No longer defined by the fame of modeling or the identities of the men who loved and hurt her, she turned inward to focus on herself. This period was about discovery, healing, and reclaiming her personal power. Photography, a skill she had dabbled in under George Harrison's encouragement, became her lifeline. Through the camera lens, she captured the world on her own terms, turning her gaze outward rather than remaining the subject of others' admiration. Her photographs, ranging from candid portraits of musicians to images of everyday life, began appearing in galleries and exhibitions. For the first time, Pattie Boyd was recognized not as a muse, but as an artist in her own right. Photography gave her a sense of agency, purpose, and accomplishment, helping her rebuild a life previously dominated by emotional turbulence and public fascination. Beyond her artistic endeavors, Pattie embarked on a journey of emotional recovery. She reflected on her past relationships, acknowledging both the love and the pain, and eventually embraced forgiveness. She maintained a respectful, albeit distant, connection with both George Harrison and Eric Clapton. George, in his later years, demonstrated kindness and thoughtfulness toward her, reflecting a gentler, more introspective version of the man she had married decades before. Even after years of betrayal and heartbreak, she could appreciate the humanity in both men while maintaining her own boundaries. Her memoir, Wonderful Tonight, published in 2007, offered the world an unprecedented glimpse into her life. It revealed not only the glamour and allure of being a muse to rock legends, but also the complexity, struggle, and resilience that defined her personal journey. Through her writing, she shared lessons about self-respect, endurance, and the importance of loving oneself first. In interviews, she reflected on her past candidly, stating, "I don't regret loving them, but I wish I had loved myself sooner." Her words resonated with readers worldwide, not just as a story of a famous model or muse, but as a story of a woman who navigated fame, betrayal, heartbreak, and ultimately discovered her own voice and independence. By 2025, Pattie Boyd had reached the age of 80, a life fully lived with grace, insight, and resilience. She continues to exhibit her photography, travel, and speak about creativity, forgiveness, and the strength that comes from surviving the trials of life. Her story serves as a testament to the enduring human spirit. Despite fame, heartbreak, and repeated betrayal, she found her own rhythm and her own peace. Pattie Boyd's life was defined by two of rock music's greatest figures, George Harrison and Eric Clapton, yet her story is about far more than fame or music. It is a story of love, endurance, and self-discovery. Her marriages to George and Eric provide a window into the complexities of human relationships, showing that love, while powerful and transformative, is not always enough to sustain happiness.